The night air hung thick and warm over the island of Oahu, carrying with it the scent of plumeria blossoms and distant ocean spray. At the Officers' Club at Wheeler Field, the Saturday evening dance had stretched long into the early morning hours of December 7th, 1941. Second Lieutenants George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, two young fighter pilots barely out of flight school, had traded their leather jackets for formal mess dress, celebrating what they assumed would be just another lazy Sunday in paradise. George Welch, 23 years old, lean and restless, hailed from Wilmington, Delaware. His family had changed his surname from Schwartz during the First War to avoid anti-German sentiment, a decision that seemed quaint now, in this new world teetering on the edge of global conflict. Ken Taylor, just 21, carried the easy confidence of his Oklahoma upbringing, his drawl still evident despite months in the tropical heat of Hawaii. The dance had dissolved into an all-night poker game, cards slapping against felt tables as bottles of beer grew warm in the humid air. Neither man noticed when the first hints of dawn began to paint the eastern sky pink and gold. They had finally decided to call it quits around 6:30 in the morning, contemplating maybe a quick swim before catching a few hours of sleep. Today really, was Sunday. Nothing ever happened on Sunday. At approximately 7:40 in the morning, while most of Wheeler Field still slept off Saturday night's festivities, a formation of aircraft appeared in the skies north of Oahu. They came in low and fast, their engines producing a distinctive, unfamiliar drone that cut through the morning stillness. Welch and Taylor had just made it back to their quarters when the first explosion shattered the peaceful morning. Both men froze, still wearing their rumpled tuxedo pants from the night before, their minds struggling to process what their ears were telling them. "What the hell was that?" Taylor said, moving toward the window. Another explosion, closer this time. Then another. The building shook. Welch was already pulling on his boots. "That's not thunder." They burst outside into chaos. The sky above Wheeler Field had transformed into something from a nightmare. Aircraft were diving and wheeling, and on their wings, clearly visible in the morning light, were painted red circles, the rising sun insignia of Imperial Japan. "Jesus Christ," Welch breathed. "We're being attacked." The first wave of Japanese aircraft, 183 planes strong, had achieved complete surprise. Led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, they had launched from 6 aircraft carriers positioned roughly 275 miles north of Oahu. The carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, had maintained radio silence for 12 days as they crossed the Pacific, their commanders gambling everything on this single, devastating blow. The attack plan was brutally efficient. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers concentrated on the battleships moored along Ford Island in Pearl Harbor itself, while fighters and bombers struck the Army Air Force's bases scattered across Oahu. Wheeler Field, Hickam Field, Bellows Field, all were hit almost simultaneously. The Japanese determined to destroy American air power on the ground before it could respond. At Wheeler Field, the carnage was immediate and overwhelming. American aircraft sat parked wingtip to wingtip, an anti-sabotage measure that now proved catastrophically vulnerable. Japanese Aichi D-3 A-Val dive bombers screamed down from the sky, releasing their bombs with practiced precision. P-40 Warhawks, P-36 Hawks, and other fighters exploded in balls of orange flame, their fuel tanks cooking off in secondary explosions that sent debris spinning through the air. Welch and Taylor stood transfixed for perhaps 3 seconds, an eternity in combat, watching their world come apart. Mechanics ran in every direction, some seeking cover, others trying desperately to roll undamaged aircraft away from the flames. Anti-aircraft guns sat silent, their ammunition locked away per peacetime regulations. It was Sunday morning in paradise, and no one had been ready for war. "The auxiliary field," Welch said suddenly, grabbing Taylor's arm. "Haleiwa! Our planes are at Haleiwa!" The 47th Pursuit Squadron had deployed 18 P-40B Warhawks to Haleiwa Auxiliary Airfield just days earlier for gunnery practice. The small grass strip sat on Oahu's north shore, roughly 10 miles from Wheeler, and hopefully far enough from the main attack to have escaped notice. Without waiting for orders, without even knowing if any officers were alive to give orders, Welch sprinted to the nearest telephone that wasn't already being used by frantic personnel trying to make sense of the attack. His hands shook as he spun the dial. "Haleiwa Auxiliary, this is Lieutenant Welch," he shouted over the sound of explosions. "Get 2 P-40s fueled and armed immediately. We're coming up." The voice on the other end started to ask questions, but Welch had already slammed down the receiver. Taylor was already running toward the parking area where they'd left Taylor's new Buick the night before. The car was untouched, remarkably. Taylor jammed the key into the ignition while Welch threw himself into the passenger seat. The engine roared to life, and Taylor stomped on the accelerator, sending gravel spraying as they fishtailed out of the parking lot. The drive to Haleiwa normally took 20 minutes at a leisurely pace. Taylor made it in under 10, pushing the Buick to speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour on the winding roads that cut through Oahu's interior. They passed burned-out vehicles, groups of soldiers taking cover in ditches, and once, heart-stopping, a Japanese Zero that swept low overhead, its pilot apparently deciding they weren't worth the ammunition.
"Faster!" Welch yelled unnecessarily. Taylor's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his eyes locked on the road as it unreeled before them. They skidded into Haleiwa Auxiliary Airfield at 7:55 in the morning, roughly 25 minutes after the attack had begun. The small field was untouched, its half-dozen buildings intact, its grass runway clear. 2 P-40 Warhawks sat on the flight line, their Allison Vive 1710 engines already warming up, courtesy of the ground crews who had taken Welch's panicked phone call seriously. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was not the most advanced fighter in the world in December 1941. It was slower than the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M20, less maneuverable, and climbed more slowly. But it was tough, built like a tank, with armor plating behind the pilot's seat and self-sealing fuel tanks, and it was armed with 6 machine guns, 4 .30-caliber Browning guns in the wings, and 2 50-caliber guns in the nose, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. Or at least, it should have been. The crew chief met them as they leaped from the car, still wearing their tuxedo pants and dress shirts from the night before. "Sir, we've only got 30 cal ammo loaded," he said, talking fast. "No time to load the 50s, and we didn't know if—" "It'll have to do," Welch cut him off. "We're going up." The two pilots ran to their aircraft. Welch's P-40 bore the number 44 on its fuselage. Taylor's was number 47. Both planes wore the standard Army Air Corps olive drab and neutral gray paint scheme with white stars and blue circles on the wings and fuselage. Welch strapped himself into the narrow cockpit, his fingers moving through the pre-flight checklist from muscle memory. Fuel mixture rich. Throttle cracked open 1 inch. Magnetos on. He glanced over at Taylor, saw him give a thumbs up, and pushed the starter button. The big Allison engine coughed, caught, and roared to life. 12 cylinders firing in sequence, the propeller beginning to turn. The vibration through the airframe was familiar, almost comforting. This was what they had trained for. This was what all those hours of flying, all that gunnery practice, all those formation drills had been preparing them for. They just hadn't known it would come so soon, or like this. Welch released the brakes and gave the Warhawk throttle, the fighter bumping across the grass field, gathering speed. Beside him, Taylor's P-40 did the same, the two aircraft moving in rough formation toward the far end of the runway. At 60 miles per hour, Welch eased back on the stick. The Warhawk lifted smoothly into the air, Hawaii's green mountains falling away beneath him. Taylor was right on his wing, tucked in close. For just a moment, climbing into the morning sky, it felt like any other training flight. The air was smooth, the visibility unlimited, the Pacific Ocean spreading blue and infinite to the west. Then Welch looked south, toward Pearl Harbor, and saw the smoke. The smoke rose in towering black columns that reached thousands of feet into the tropical sky, fed by burning oil from ruptured battleships and countless smaller fires across the harbor.
Even from 10 miles away, Welch could see the orange glow of flames at the base of those pillars. Pearl Harbor was burning. He keyed his radio. "Ken, you see that?" "I see it," Taylor's voice came back, tight and controlled. "Jesus, George, the whole fleet must be on fire." They banked south, climbing for altitude. The P-40Bs were heavy, and gaining height took time. Welch kept his eyes scanning the sky, looking for the distinctive silhouette of enemy aircraft. He didn't have to wait long. At approximately 8:10 in the morning, with their Warhawks passing through 8,000 feet over the central plain of Oahu, Welch spotted them. A formation of Japanese aircraft, perhaps a dozen strong, heading back north toward their carriers. From this distance, he couldn't tell if they were fighters or bombers, but it didn't matter. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high," he called. "Follow me in." Welch shoved the throttle forward to the stops, the Allison engine responding with a surge of power. The airspeed indicator climbed past 200 miles per hour, then 250. He checked his gun sight, a simple ring and bead arrangement, and flipped the safety cover off the gun button on his control stick. The Japanese formation was spread out, apparently believing the attack had been completely successful and no American aircraft remained to challenge them. They were climbing, probably looking to gain altitude for the flight back to their carriers, and they hadn't seen the two Warhawks diving out of the sun behind them. Welch selected the trailing aircraft in the formation, an Aichi D-3A dive bomber, what American intelligence would later codename Val. The dive bomber was slower than his P-40, its fixed landing gear creating drag. He closed the distance rapidly, his heart hammering in his chest. At 300 yards, he pressed the gun button. 4 .30-caliber Browning machine guns opened fire, their combined rate of fire nearly 2,400 rounds per minute. The guns were harmonized to converge at 300 yards, and Welch watched his tracers, every fifth round, arc through the air toward the enemy bomber. His first burst went low. Welch corrected, walking the tracers up into the bomber's fuselage. Pieces flew off the Val's tail section. The rear gunner, a single 7.7mm machine gun, returned fire, but the range was too great and the angle too difficult. Welch pressed his attack, closing to 200 yards, then 100, his guns hammering continuously. The Val's canopy shattered. The aircraft began to trail smoke, then suddenly nosed over into a steep dive. Welch pulled up hard to avoid following it down, the G-forces pressing him into his seat. He craned his neck, watching the stricken bomber fall away below, trailing fire. "Splash one!" Taylor's voice crackled in his headset. "George, I got one! He went straight in!" There was no time to celebrate. The Japanese formation had scattered, some aircraft diving for the deck, others climbing and turning to meet this unexpected threat. Welch hauled the Warhawk around in a tight turn, his vision graying at the edges from the G-load, searching for another target. A Mitsubishi A6 M20 fighter materialized in front of him, perhaps 500 yards ahead, turning hard. The Zero was the Imperial Japanese Navy's premier fighter, a marvel of lightweight construction and maneuverability. It could outturn anything in the sky, climb like a rocket, and had extraordinary range. But it achieved these qualities by sacrificing armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. It was a thoroughbred, brilliant, and fragile. Welch didn't try to turn with the Zero. Instead, he used the P-40's superior diving speed, rolling inverted and pulling through into a split S maneuver. The negative G's lifted him against his straps as the Warhawk's nose dropped toward the earth. Then the positive G's slammed him back into the seat as he bottomed out of the dive, now heading in the opposite direction at nearly 350 miles per hour. The Zero pilot, expecting the American to follow him into a turning fight, had been caught off guard. Welch came up behind him at high speed, the range closing fast. 200 yards, 150, 100. He fired. The .30 caliber rounds stitched across the Zero's fuselage and wing root. The lightweight fighter shuddered under the impact. Then one wing folded back, and the aircraft tumbled out of control, pieces flying off in all directions.
Welch flashed past the disintegrating Zero, already looking for the next threat. The sky had become a confused melee of aircraft, turning and diving, tracers lacing through the air in all directions. Welch caught glimpses of Taylor's P-40, identified by its number, slashing through the formation. Black puffs of anti-aircraft fire dotted the sky, American guns finally getting into action, adding to the chaos. Another dive bomber crossed in front of Welch, and he snapped off a quick burst, seeing strikes on the engine cowling before the target slipped away. His ammunition counter was spinning down alarmingly fast. Each of his 4 wing guns held 500 rounds, but at the rate he was firing, that wouldn't last long. "George, brake right!" Taylor's voice screamed in his headphones. Welch yanked the stick hard over without thinking, trusting his wingman's eyes. The Warhawk rolled violently to the right, and an instant later, a stream of tracers flashed through the space where he had been. A Zero had gotten on his tail. He hadn't seen it, and Taylor had just saved his life. "Thanks, Ken," he managed, breathing hard. "We're even. Watch your 6. I'm Winchester." Winchester, pilot slang for out of ammunition. Taylor had expended his load in the furious engagement. Welch checked his own ammunition counter and swore. Maybe 100 rounds left, total. Not enough for another sustained engagement. "Both of us," Welch acknowledged. "Let's break off. Head back to Wheeler, rearm, and refuel." They turned west, diving for speed, putting distance between themselves and the remaining Japanese aircraft. Welch kept checking his mirrors, expecting pursuit, but none came. The enemy formation was scattered and demoralized, their pilots eager to break off and head for the safety of their carriers. As they descended toward Wheeler Field, the full scope of the devastation became apparent. The neat rows of American aircraft they had seen that morning were gone, replaced by twisted, smoking wreckage. The operations building had taken a direct hit. One wall collapsed. Fire trucks raced back and forth, their crews fighting blazes that seemed to spring up faster than they could be contained. But the runway was clear, hastily swept of debris by ground crews working under fire. Welch dropped his landing gear and flaps, the Warhawk bleeding off speed as he lined up for final approach. The wheels kissed the concrete at 8:45 in the morning, roughly 50 minutes after the attack had begun. Taylor landed 30 seconds behind him, both aircraft taxiing quickly to the revetments where ground crews waited with fuel hoses and ammunition belts. Welch killed the engine and climbed stiffly out of the cockpit, his dress shirt soaked with sweat, his hands trembling slightly with adrenaline. A crew chief ran up, his face blackened with soot. "Lieutenant Welch, you got one? We saw you shoot down a Jap." "2, I think," Welch said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "Maybe 3. I'm not sure." He turned to Taylor, who was walking over from his own aircraft. "Ken?" "2 confirmed," Taylor said. "1 probable." "This is insane, George. There must be 200 of them up there." A major Welch didn't recognize approached at a run. "You 2, what squadron?" 47th Pursuit, sir," Taylor responded automatically. "I don't care where you came from," the major interrupted. "Can you go back up?" Welch and Taylor exchanged glances. They were exhausted, operating on no sleep and pure adrenaline. Their aircraft needed fuel and ammunition, but the sky was still full of enemy planes, and every American fighter that could get airborne made a difference. "Yes, sir," they said simultaneously. "Then get your birds rearmed and get back up there. We've got a second wave incoming." The ground crews swarmed over both P-40s, working with desperate efficiency. Fuel hoses snaked into the wing tanks. Armorers struggled to load ammunition belts into the wing gun bays, their hands shaking. Someone had found leather flight jackets for Welch and Taylor, replacing their ridiculous tuxedo shirts. Someone else thrust canteens of water into their hands. Welch drank deeply, the lukewarm water tasting better than anything he could remember. His throat was raw from breathing hard at altitude, and his ears still rang from the sound of the guns. He watched the armorers work, counting the belts as they fed them into the guns. This time, they were loading the .50 caliber nose guns as well. Heavier punch, but less ammunition. "How bad is it?" he asked the crew chief. "Pearl, I mean." The man's face went gray. "Bad, sir. Real bad. The Arizona's gone.
The Oklahoma capsized. The California's settling. I heard the West Virginia's burning bow to stern. He swallowed hard. They're saying thousands dead. Welch felt something cold settle in his stomach. Thousands. He knew men on those ships, had shared drinks with them at the officers' club, played cards with them. The Arizona alone had a crew of over 1,500 men. 10 minutes, sir, the crew chief said, stepping back from the aircraft. She's ready whenever you are. Welch looked at Taylor, saw his own shock and rage reflected in the younger man's eyes. They were fighter pilots, trained to think in terms of individual combat, one aircraft against another. The idea of thousands of sailors trapped in burning, sinking ships, unable to fight back, unable to even see their attackers. It was almost incomprehensible. Let's go kill some more of them, Taylor said quietly. They climbed back into their cockpits. The engine started on the first try, the familiar routine almost comforting in its normalcy. Welch ran through his checks mechanically, his mind already focusing on what was coming next. The major had said a second wave. That meant more aircraft, fresh pilots, possibly better coordination. It also meant another chance. At 9:15 in the morning, Welch and Taylor took off again from Wheeler Field, their Warhawks climbing into a sky that had become a battlefield. This time they knew what to expect. This time they were angry. The second wave of Japanese aircraft hit Oahu at approximately 9 o'clock in the morning, 170 aircraft strong. Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki led this formation, composed primarily of high-level bombers and dive bombers, with fewer fighters than the first wave. Their targets were the installations and ships that had survived the initial onslaught, finishing what Fuchida's first wave had begun. Welch and Taylor climbed hard to the northeast, their eyes scanning the sky methodically. The technique was called clearing your six, constantly checking behind and around, never fixating on any single point. In aerial combat, the enemy you didn't see was the one who killed you. At 10,000 feet, they leveled off and began a sweeping turn that would take them over Ava Mooring Mast Field and then toward Pearl Harbor itself. The smoke from the burning harbor had spread across the entire southern portion of Oahu, a pall that turned the bright morning into something darker, more ominous. "Tally-ho!" Taylor's voice cracked through the radio. 2 o'clock low. Looks like a whole squadron of dive bombers. Welch snapped his head right and down. There, a formation of 9 Aichi D-3A Vals, flying in a loose V formation at about 6,000 feet, heading toward what remained of the Pacific Fleet. They were perhaps 3 miles away, unescorted by fighters, apparently confident that American air defenses had been completely neutralized. "I see them," Welch acknowledged. "Take the right side. I'll take the left. Hit them fast and break away. Don't get caught in their formation." "Roger that." The 2 Warhawks rolled into steep dives, building speed rapidly. The P-40 was a mediocre dogfighter, but it was an excellent boom and zoom aircraft. The tactic was simple. Dive from altitude at high speed, make one firing pass, then use that speed to climb back up out of range before the enemy could react. Never turn and fight. Never slow down. Speed was life. Welch's airspeed indicator wound up past 300 miles per hour, past 350, approaching 400. The dive angle was nearly vertical, the engine screaming, the wings beginning to buffet slightly from the airflow. He lined up on the leftmost valve in the formation, his finger resting lightly on the gun trigger. At 500 yards, he opened fire. All 6 guns now, 4 30s in the wings, 2 50s in the nose, roared to life. The sound was different from before, deeper, more authoritative. The 50 caliber rounds were 3 times heavier than the 30 caliber, and when they hit something, they tore it apart. The Val never had a chance. Welch's fire converged on the dive bomber's engine and cockpit area. The big 50 caliber rounds punched through the light aircraft like hammers through paper. The Val's engine literally exploded, pieces of the cylinder block and crankcase flying in all directions. The aircraft nosed over sharply and fell away, trailing fire and debris. Welch pulled out of his dive at 4,000 feet, the G-forces brutal, his vision tunneling to a narrow point directly ahead. He held the pull, trusting his aircraft, trusting his training. The Warhawk groaned but held together, leveling out and immediately beginning to climb again. Behind him, the Japanese formation had scattered like startled birds. Taylor's attack on the right side had been equally devastating. Welch saw another valve falling in flames, wing folding back as it tumbled toward the ocean below. But the other dive bombers were taking evasive action now, their pilots throwing their aircraft into violent maneuvers. One valve nosed over into a near-vertical dive, pulling out barely 200 feet above the water. Another reversed course entirely, heading back north at full throttle. "They're running!" Taylor called out, his voice exultant. "George, they're breaking off the attack!" It was true. The valve formation, having lost 2 aircraft in a matter of seconds, had abandoned whatever target they had been assigned. The remaining 7 bombers were scattering, each pilot now concerned only with survival, their formation cohesion gone. Welch selected another target, a valve that was climbing and turning to the east. He advanced his throttle and banked hard, cutting inside the bomber's turn. The Japanese rear gunner saw him coming and opened fire, tracers floating lazily toward the Warhawk. Welch jinked left, then right, spoiling the gunner's aim, then steadied for his own shot. 2-second burst. The 50s hammered, vibrating the entire airframe. Strikes sparkled along the valve's fuselage and wing root. Something critical broke. Control cables, probably, because the dive bomber suddenly snap-rolled to the right and entered a flat spin. No parachute emerged as it spiraled down toward the cane fields below. Welch's ammunition counter was dropping fast. The 50 caliber guns ate through their belts voraciously. Each gun held only 200 rounds, and at a combined rate of fire of 1,300 rounds per minute, that gave him less than 20 seconds of sustained firing time. He needed to make every shot count. Another valve crossed his nose, range about 400 yards, traveling right to left. A deflection shot, the hardest kind, requiring him to aim not where the target was, but where it would be when the bullets arrived. Welch had practiced this hundreds of times on towed targets over the Pacific, learning to judge speed and distance, to lead the target just the right amount. He pulled the nose ahead of the valve, estimated the lead, and pressed the trigger. Short burst, 2 seconds. The tracers arced out, and for a moment, he thought he had missed. Then the valve's left wing erupted in flames. The dive bomber rolled inverted and plunged straight down. The pilot probably already dead. "George, check 6!" Taylor's warning came urgent and sharp. Welch looked back over his left shoulder and felt his blood turn to ice. 3 Zeros, in a tight V formation, were diving on him from above and behind. He had been so focused on the dive bombers that he had forgotten the cardinal rule: always check your 6. He slammed the throttle forward and shoved the stick forward and right, the Warhawk rolling into a split S. The world inverted, sky and earth trading places, and Welch pulled through hard, his vision graying out, blood draining from his head. The P-40 dove toward the ground at full power, airspeed building rapidly. The Zeros followed, but they couldn't keep up with the diving Warhawk. The P-40, for all its faults in a turning fight, could outdive anything the Japanese had. Welch watched his altimeter unwind at an alarming rate. 8,000 feet, 6,000, 4,000, and the airspeed indicator climbed past 420 miles per hour, approaching the aircraft's never-exceed speed. At 2,000 feet, he hauled back on the stick with both hands, pulling 8 or 9 Gs, his vision contracting to a tiny tunnel, consciousness threatening to slip away. The Warhawk groaned and shuddered, but bottomed out of the dive at 500 feet, now heading in the opposite direction at tremendous speed. He leveled the wings and looked back. The 3 Zeros had given up the chase, climbing back to altitude.
They had the height advantage and better maneuverability, but the American pilot had shown he knew how to use his aircraft's strengths. It wasn't worth pursuing. Welch took a shaky breath and checked his instruments. Fuel was getting low, maybe 20 minutes remaining. Ammunition nearly exhausted. And his nerves were starting to fray, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving behind a jittery exhaustion. "Ken, where are you?" he called on the radio. "South of Pearl, about 3,000 feet, Taylor responded. "I'm Winchester again, George, and I'm getting low on fuel. I think we need to head back." Welch scanned the sky one more time. The second wave was still in progress, but the fury of the attack seemed to be diminishing. American anti-aircraft fire had intensified dramatically. The gunners were getting organized now, and the sky was filled with black puffs of flak. More American fighters were airborne too. Welch caught glimpses of other P-40s, and even a few P-36 Hawks mixing it up with Japanese aircraft. The surprise was over. The Japanese had achieved everything they were going to achieve today. Now it was just a matter of getting their aircraft back to the carriers before losses became prohibitive. "Agreed," Welch said. "Let's go home." They rendezvoused over the central plain and turned north toward Wheeler Field, flying in loose formation. Welch kept checking his mirrors obsessively, expecting a zero to appear at any moment, but the sky behind them remained clear. As they approached Wheeler, Welch could see that the fires had been brought under control, though smoke still rose from dozens of locations. The field looked like a scrapyard, burned-out aircraft pushed to the sides of the runway, craters hastily filled, debris everywhere. But it was operational, and that was what mattered. He dropped his landing gear and set up for approach, his hands moving through the familiar motions with practiced ease despite his exhaustion. The wheels touched down at 9:50 in the morning, and Welch taxied to the dispersal area where ground crews waited. As soon as he cut the engine, a major he recognized, Major Gordon Austin, the operations officer, ran up to the aircraft. Welch climbed down from the cockpit, his legs unsteady, and snapped to attention. "At ease, Lieutenant," Austin said quickly. "How many?" "Sir?" Welch's mind was still foggy. "How many enemy aircraft did you shoot down?" Welch tried to think. The first sortie, 2, maybe 3. The second sortie, 3 more, he was pretty sure. 5 or 6 confirmed, sir. Maybe more. It all happened so fast. Austin turned to Taylor, who had just climbed out of his own aircraft. "And you, Lieutenant Taylor?" 4 confirmed, sir, Taylor said. "Possibly 5. Austin nodded slowly, a strange expression on his face. "You two realize you're probably the only American pilots who shot down any enemy aircraft today? The only ones who even got airborne during the attack?" Welch and Taylor looked at each other, the full weight of what they had done beginning to sink in. Around them, Wheeler Field was a disaster area. Across the island, Pearl Harbor was still burning, ships sunk or sinking, thousands dead or dying. The entire Pacific Fleet had been crippled in a single morning. But 2 young pilots, operating without orders, without support, flying obsolescent fighters against overwhelming odds, had proven that Americans could fight back, that they would fight back. "Sir," Welch said slowly, "we just did what we were trained to do, what any pilot would have done." Austin shook his head. "Not any pilot, Lieutenant. Most of them never made it to their aircraft. You two did, and you made the enemy pay for what they did here today." The afternoon of December 7th descended over Oahu like a shroud. The Japanese strike force, having accomplished its mission with devastating efficiency, turned north and withdrew toward their carriers. By 11 o'clock in the morning, the last enemy aircraft had disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a scene of unprecedented destruction. Welch and Taylor spent the next hours in a blur of debriefings, questions from intelligence officers, and attempts to make sense of what had happened. The full scope of the disaster emerged slowly, in fragments and whispers, each piece of information more terrible than the last. The battleship Arizona had exploded when a bomb penetrated her forward magazine. She sank in 9 minutes, taking 1,177 men with her,
more than half her crew entombed in the twisted steel that would become their permanent grave. The Oklahoma had capsized, trapping over 400 men inside her hull. Frantic rescue efforts were underway, cutting torches and pneumatic hammers working against time to reach sailors trapped in air pockets, tapping desperately on the metal walls. The West Virginia had settled to the bottom of the harbor, burning fiercely. The California was sinking slowly, her crew fighting to keep her afloat. The Nevada, brave, defiant Nevada, had managed to get underway during the attack, the only battleship to do so, but she had taken multiple torpedo and bomb hits and been forced to beach herself to avoid sinking in the channel and blocking the harbor entrance. In all, 18 ships were sunk or damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, 2,403 Americans killed, 1,178 wounded. The Pacific Fleet, America's primary deterrent against Japanese aggression, had been gutted in less than 2 hours. And yet, amid the catastrophe, there were stories of incredible heroism. Chief Boatswain John Finn had manned a machine gun in the open during the entire attack, continuing to fire despite being wounded multiple times. Ensign Joe Taussig had remained at his station, directing anti-aircraft fire even after losing a leg. Mess Attendant Doris Miller, an African-American sailor who had never been trained on weapons, Navy regulations forbade it, had manned a .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun and fired until it ran out of ammunition. And 2 young pilots had gotten airborne and fought back, shooting down at least 9 enemy aircraft between them, possibly more. As evening approached, Welch and Taylor found themselves sitting on the wing of Taylor's battered P-40, sharing a canteen of water and watching the sun set behind the smoke that still rose from Pearl Harbor. Neither man had slept in over 36 hours. They should have been unconscious, but adrenaline and shock kept them wired and wakeful. "My folks are in Oklahoma City," Taylor said quietly. "They'll have heard by now. Radio, probably. They'll be worried sick." Welch nodded. "My mother's in Delaware. She'll hear too. The whole country will know by tomorrow morning." "Everything's different now," Taylor said. "We're at war. Really at war. Not just Europe's war anymore. Ours." It was true. For years, America had watched the conflict spreading across Europe and Asia with a mixture of concern and isolationist reluctance. The wars in China, in Europe, in Africa, they seemed distant, someone else's problem. Even the Army's expansion in 1940 and 1941, the peacetime draft, the Lend-Lease aid to Britain, these had felt like precautionary measures, hedges against a war that might never come. Now, war had come, explosively and irrevocably. Japan had struck the first blow, but Welch had no doubt that Germany and Italy would honor their alliance and declare war on America within days. The whole world was going up in flames, and the United States was now fully engaged. "They'll want us to do it again," Welch said. "Fight, I mean. Tomorrow, next week, next year, however long this takes." Taylor managed a tired smile. "Think we're up for it? Do we have a choice?" A jeep pulled up beside the aircraft and Major Austin climbed out. He looked as exhausted as they felt, his uniform stained with soot and hydraulic fluid, his face drawn. "Lieutenants," he said, "I've just come from a meeting with Colonel Flood. You're both being put in for commendations, probably the Distinguished Service Cross. The General wants to talk to you tomorrow." Welch and Taylor exchanged glances. Medals seemed almost obscene, given what had happened to the men on the ships, the sailors who had died without ever seeing their attackers. "Sir," Welch said carefully, "we just did our jobs. There are men who deserve medals more than we do. The gunners who stayed at their posts, the damage control parties on the ships, the—" "I know," Austin interrupted gently. "Believe me, I know. There will be plenty of medals, and most of them will be posthumous. But what you two did today mattered, Lieutenant. You showed that we can fight back, that we will fight back. People need to know that." He paused, then continued more quietly. "The Navy's counting their dead. The Army's counting theirs. The Marines lost good men too. But you know what nobody's counting? Enemy losses in the air. Because except for you two, we didn't inflict any. Every Japanese aircraft that went home today was shot down by you. That wasn't quite true. Some anti-aircraft fire had been effective, and Welch had heard rumors of a few other pilots getting airborne late in the attack, but he understood Austin's point. In the midst of the worst military disaster in American history, 2 pilots had proven that Americans could still fight, could still win. "Get some sleep," Austin said. "Both of you. That's an order. Tomorrow's going to be chaos. Everyone expecting another attack, rumors flying, orders contradicting each other. I need you sharp." He climbed back into his Jeep and drove off into the gathering darkness, leaving Welch and Taylor alone again.
"You think they'll come back?" Taylor asked. "The Japs? Hit us again tomorrow?"
Welch considered it. "If I were them, I would. Finish the job. Hit the fuel storage tanks they missed today, the repair facilities, the submarine base." He shook his head. "But I don't think they will. They got what they came for, the battleships. And they lost, 29 aircraft? Maybe more? That's not a sustainable loss rate, not operating this far from home." 29 we know about, Taylor corrected. "Could be more. I saw at least 3 go down that neither of us shot at. A fire, probably." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. It was strange. The stars looked the same as they always had. The same constellations visible from Oahu. The same universe surrounding them. But everything had changed. The peaceful world of Saturday night, the world of dances and poker games and lazy Sunday mornings, was gone forever. A thought occurred to Welch. "Ken, you remember what you said this morning, when we first saw the Japanese planes?" "I said a lot of things. Which part?" "You said, 'This can't be happening.' Remember?" Taylor nodded slowly. "Yeah, seems like 100 years ago." "It does. But here's the thing. It is happening. It did happen. And tomorrow, we have to figure out what comes next." "What do you think comes next?" Welch looked toward Pearl Harbor, where fires still burned among the wreckage of the Pacific Fleet. "We rebuild. We train. We get more aircraft, better aircraft. We find the Japanese fleet and we hit them back, harder than they hit us today. We make them regret what they did here." "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple. It's going to be long and bloody and terrible. Men we know are going to die. Maybe we're going to die." Welch stood up, stretching stiff muscles. "But that's the job now."
"That's what we signed up for, even if we didn't know it at the time." Taylor climbed down from the wing and stood beside his friend. "You think we'll win? Eventually?" "I know we will," Welch said with absolute certainty. "Because we have to. Because the alternative is unthinkable. And because today, even in the middle of the worst defeat we've ever suffered, we proved we can fight. We can win." They walked back toward the operations building, where someone had set up cots for the pilots. Around them, Wheeler Field buzzed with activity despite the late hour. Ground crews worked under floodlights to salvage damaged aircraft. Guards manned defensive positions, watching the sky nervously for another attack. Medical personnel treated wounded, their white uniforms stained red. Tomorrow, Welch knew, would bring new challenges. There would be investigations into how the attack had succeeded so completely. There would be recriminations and finger-pointing. There would be fear and uncertainty, and a nation suddenly thrust into a two-ocean war for which it was woefully unprepared. But there would also be determination. There would be Americans rolling up their sleeves and getting to work, building the ships and planes and weapons needed to fight back. There would be men enlisting by the thousands, eager to avenge Pearl Harbor. There would be women going to work in factories, farmers increasing production, scientists developing new technologies. The sleeping giant, as someone would later put it, had been awakened. Welch lay down on one of the cots, still wearing his borrowed flight jacket,
too tired even to remove his boots. Around him, other pilots were doing the same. Men who had survived the day through luck or skill or both. Some slept, others stared at the ceiling, processing what they had seen and done. Taylor settled onto the cot next to Welch's. "George?" "Yeah?" "Thanks. For today. For not hesitating when we could have just taken cover.
For leading. Welch turned his head to look at his friend. "You didn't hesitate either, Ken. We did it together." "Still, thanks. Get some sleep. Austin's right. Tomorrow's going to be chaos." But sleep didn't come easily despite the exhaustion. Welch's mind kept replaying the day's events over and over. The first explosion, the drive to Haleiwa, the feeling of the gun trigger under his finger, the sight of enemy aircraft falling in flames, the desperate pullout from his dive, G-forces crushing him into his seat, the faces of the ground crews hoping desperately that American pilots could make a difference. Sometime after midnight, exhaustion finally won, and Welch drifted into an uneasy sleep, his dreams filled with falling aircraft and burning ships and the sound of machine guns hammering in the tropical sky. When he woke 6 hours later, it was to a changed world. The radio brought news that Congress had declared war on Japan, with only one dissenting vote. President Roosevelt's speech to the nation had called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The whole country was mobilizing, and 2 young fighter pilots from Wheeler Field, who had simply done their duty when chaos reigned, had become symbols of American resilience and determination. The war had begun. The weeks following the attack transformed Oahu from a tropical paradise into an armed fortress. Barbed wire appeared on beaches where families had picnicked just days before. Anti-aircraft batteries sprouted on every hill and rooftop. Blackout curtains covered windows at night, and air raid sirens tested regularly, their wailing a constant reminder that war had come to American soil. For Welch and Taylor, life became a whirlwind of activity that left little time for reflection. They flew combat air patrols daily, searching empty skies for Japanese aircraft that never came. They trained new pilots arriving from the mainland, sharing the hard-won lessons of December 7th. They participated in countless investigations and debriefings. Military intelligence officers trying to understand exactly what had happened and how to prevent it from happening again. The official tally of their accomplishments that Sunday morning was eventually settled at 4 confirmed kills each, with several probables. The exact number would never be known with certainty. The chaos of combat, multiple aircraft engaging the same targets, the difficulty of confirming crashes in the ocean or remote areas of Oahu, all conspired to make precise accounting impossible. But 9 enemy aircraft destroyed by 2 pilots in obsolescent fighters during America's darkest hour was achievement enough. The promised medals came through in early January. Both men received the Distinguished Service Cross, America's second highest military decoration for valor. The ceremonies were brief and businesslike. There was a war on, after all, and no time for elaborate celebrations. Lieutenant General Delos Emmons, who had replaced the relieved General Short as commander of Hawaiian Department, pinned the medals on their chests and shook their hands. "The nation is proud of you," Emmons said simply. "You showed us how to fight back." But Welch and Taylor both knew that the real heroes of December 7th were the men who hadn't survived. The sailors trapped in the capsized Oklahoma, some of whom had lived for days in air pockets before rescue efforts reached them, or failed to reach them. The anti-aircraft gunners who had manned their weapons despite having no protection from strafing fighters. The damage control parties who had fought fires and flooding on sinking ships. The pilots who had tried to reach their aircraft and died in the attempt. Over 1,000 sailors still lay entombed in the Arizona, their ship now a permanent memorial to that terrible morning. The Navy had given up trying to recover the bodies. The wreckage was too unstable, the risk too great. Instead,
the Arizona would remain where she had fallen, a steel coffin resting on the harbor bottom, oil still seeping slowly from her ruptured fuel tanks, in a persistent reminder of the price paid that day. As winter turned to spring in 1942, the war news remained grim. Hong Kong had fallen to the Japanese on Christmas Day. Manila fell in January. Singapore, the great British fortress in the east, capitulated in February, in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. The Japanese seemed unstoppable, rolling across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands with frightening speed. But there were glimmers of hope. In April, Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers on a daring raid against Tokyo, launching from the carrier Hornet. The raid did minimal physical damage, but proved that Japan was vulnerable, that American forces could strike back. The psychological impact was enormous on both sides. Then came May and the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval engagement in history where the opposing ships never saw each other, the fighting conducted entirely by carrier-based aircraft. The battle was tactically inconclusive, but strategically significant, halting the Japanese advance toward Australia and New Guinea. June brought Midway, the turning point. American codebreakers had discovered Japanese plans to attack Midway Island, allowing Admiral Nimitz to position his carriers in ambush. In a battle lasting 3 days, American dive bombers caught the Japanese carrier fleet, with aircraft on deck being refueled and rearmed. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were turned into flaming wrecks. A 4th would sink later that day. Japan's carrier supremacy, one with such devastating effect at Pearl Harbor, was broken forever. Welch and Taylor followed these developments from Hawaii, frustrated at being kept stateside while the war raged across the Pacific. They had applied repeatedly for transfer to combat squadrons, but the Army seemed determined to keep them in Hawaii, using their expertise to train the endless stream of new pilots arriving from flight schools in the States. "They're treating us like mascots," Taylor complained one evening in July, 6 months after the attack. "Show the new guys the heroes of Pearl Harbor, give them a pep talk, send them off to war while we sit here safe." Welch understood the frustration. He felt it himself. But he also understood the logic. "We're doing important work, Ken. These kids we're training, they're going to need every advantage we can give them. If we can keep just one of them alive with what we teach them, that matters." "I know. I just want to be doing more than training flights and patrols." Their chance came in August. The Marines had landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, seizing a partially constructed Japanese airfield and renaming it Henderson Field. The Japanese response was furious and immediate, pouring troops onto the island and conducting air raids almost daily. Marine fighter pilots flying F-4F Wildcats fought desperately to defend the airfield, but losses were heavy and replacements were desperately needed. Welch and Taylor were finally granted their transfer requests and assigned to the 36th Fighter Squadron, preparing to deploy to the South Pacific. They packed their meager belongings with undisguised enthusiasm, said goodbye to the pilots they had trained, and boarded a transport ship bound for the war zone. Before they left, they made one final visit to Pearl Harbor. The harbor had been transformed in the 8 months since the attack. Most of the damaged ships had been refloated and sent to West Coast shipyards for repair. New construction was everywhere: dry docks, machine shops, fuel storage facilities. The Navy was rebuilding, preparing for the long campaign to retake the Pacific. But the Arizona remained, her superstructure still visible above the water, oil still leaking from her hull in a rainbow sheen that spread across the surface. A small launch took them out to the wreck, where they stood silently, looking down at the rusted metal that contained the bodies of so many men. "I think about them sometimes," Taylor said quietly. "The guys we saw die that day. The ones on the ships, the ones in the aircraft we shot down. They had families, friends, people who loved them, just like us. War doesn't care about that, Welch replied. It takes everyone, the good and the bad, the prepared and the unprepared, the lucky and the unlucky. All we can do is honor them by finishing what they started. They stood a while longer, then returned to shore. The next day, they shipped out. The war in the South Pacific was everything they had imagined, and worse. The heat, the disease, the primitive living conditions, these were hardships they could endure. But the combat was relentless and unforgiving. Japanese pilots were skilled and fearless, willing to sacrifice themselves for the emperor. Mechanical failures were common, and a forced landing over water in shark-infested seas was often a death sentence. Welch proved to be as skilled in combat as he had been at Pearl Harbor. Flying the new P-38 Lightning twin-engine fighter, he racked up an impressive tally of victories, 12 confirmed, 4 probables. He survived being shot down twice, once ditching in the ocean and swimming to shore, once crash landing at Henderson Field with a dead engine. Taylor, too, distinguished himself, flying escort missions for bombers and strafing runs against Japanese positions. He was promoted to captain, then major, taking command of a fighter squadron and earning a reputation as an aggressive and innovative tactician. But the war took its toll. Friends died, their aircraft simply failing to return from missions. Disease claimed others: malaria, dengue fever, dysentery. The stress was constant, the fear never entirely absent, even for veterans. Men who had been confident and eager became hollow-eyed and jumpy, flinching at unexpected sounds. In September 1944, nearly 3 years after Pearl Harbor, Welch was flying a combat mission over the Philippines when his luck finally ran out. The official report would later state that he was shot down by enemy ground fire while strafing a Japanese airfield. His aircraft crashed in flames, and his body was never recovered. Kenneth Taylor survived the war, returning home with the rank of lieutenant colonel, a chest full of medals, and memories he would carry for the rest of his long life. He left the military after the war, married, raised a family, and built a successful business career. But he never forgot that Sunday morning in December, or the friend who had been beside him in the sky over Oahu. Years later, when historians and journalists asked Taylor about Pearl Harbor, about those frantic minutes of combat that had made him a hero, he always gave the same answer. "We just did what needed doing," he would say. "What any pilot would have done. George and I, we were in the right place at the right time, and we had aircraft that would fly and ammunition to shoot. That's all." The real heroes were the men who died that day, who never had a chance to fight back. We fought for them. In 1991, on the 50th anniversary of the attack, Taylor returned to Pearl Harbor for the commemoration ceremonies. He was 71 years old now, his hair white, his hands no longer steady enough to fly a fighter. He stood on the deck of a Navy vessel above the sunken Arizona, surrounded by other veterans, sailors who had survived the sinking ships, Marines who had manned anti-aircraft guns, civilians who had treated the wounded. The Navy chaplain said prayers. A bugler played taps. Divers placed a wreath on the Arizona's submerged hull, where it would slowly sink to rest among the remains of 1,177 men. Taylor thought about that morning, 50 years gone, but still vivid in his memory. The sound of the first explosion, the sight of red circles on silver wings, the scramble to Haleiwa, George's voice on the radio, "Tally-ho!" The rattle of machine guns, the smell of cordite and smoke and fear. And he thought about George Welch, his friend and wingman, who had died in a jungle on the other side of the world, fighting the war that had begun that Sunday morning. George had been 23 when they flew together over Pearl Harbor. He was 26 when he died. So young. So many of them had been so young. The ceremony concluded. The crowd began to disperse, but Taylor remained at the rail, looking down at the water, at the oil still seeping from the Arizona after half a century, at the memorial that had been built over the wreck. A young sailor approached, perhaps 20 years old, crisp in his dress whites. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "Are you Colonel Taylor, the pilot from December 7th? Taylor nodded. "I am." "I just wanted to say thank you for what you did that day, for showing us how to fight." Taylor looked at the young man, seeing in his face the same eagerness, the same confidence, the same innocence that he and George had carried on that distant morning before the world changed. "You're welcome," he said. "But remember, the real lesson of Pearl Harbor isn't about fighting. It's about vigilance, about never assuming that peace will last forever, that danger is always somewhere else, happening to someone else." That's what we learned that day, in the hardest way possible. The sailor nodded thoughtfully and moved away. Taylor remained a while longer, then turned and walked slowly back toward shore, carrying with him the weight of memory and loss and pride in what he and his generation had accomplished. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been a catastrophe, a disaster of intelligence failures and unpreparedness that cost thousands of American lives. But it had also been the beginning of something, the awakening of American power and determination, the forging of what would become the greatest military force the world had ever seen. And on that terrible morning, when everything seemed lost, when the Pacific Fleet burned and American air power lay in ruins, two young pilots had climbed into their fighters and shown that Americans would fight back, would never surrender, would ultimately prevail. That was the legacy of December 7th, 1941. That was what George Welch and Kenneth Taylor and all the others who fought and died that day had given to their nation and to history. A date that would live in infamy. And a moment of courage that would live forever. The end.